Well, good morning, and thank you, Professor Stoll, for this opportunity for USC. It's a real honor, and I was trying to persuade myself not to say this, but I can't resist but quote Hamilton, "It is a delight to be in the room where it happens." So let me just make 3 points, and I'll try to be as brief as possible. The first is on Ipsos, the second is our mandate, and then the third is our approach to credit ratings. In trying to answer Ian's question, in Greece, is the main issue the debt, or is it other factors? And I would argue that other factors such as governance and political economy, I think, are the main issue, and that is a result of those governance questions. But let me try to explain that as I go through these 3 points. First of all, moving toward Ipsos without question is the way to go. And what we need to do is work ideally with the IMF and other bodies and in order to assess more accurately our statistics to become more accurate in our credit ratings. Credit ratings are very crude tools. And what DBRS, as a relatively small new credit rating agency, is trying to do is provide competition to avoid the type of mismanagement that we saw prior to the financial crisis. There is in fact no plan in Europe to reduce debt in slow-growing countries. Therefore, I think a more accurate accounting is necessary and would definitely help. In the case of Greece, if the debt burden were 37% of GDP, even at a higher interest cost, that would make a huge difference versus the current perception of gross debt to GDP of 180% of GDP at an interest cost of 2.2% of GDP. All to say that we certainly welcome Paul's idea. We'd love to learn more. We're always looking for new statistics, how to do this better. So on to our mandate. This is a very narrow one, don't forget. We're just assessing the probability of default of the central government. It's assessing the capacity, the willingness of the central government to pay its bonded debt to the private sector on time and in full, and that's it. It's not country risk. And it's nothing else. Now, there are secondary effects on the ability of a government to make those debt payments, and that's where it becomes tricky. Looking in particular at the liquid financial assets versus debt servicing payments is the most critical component. So in that regard, in the Greek case, to the extent that Greece was unable to meet those liquid debt payments, that's when we start to get concerned. And there is an open question that we have of whether Greece can make its summer payments this year. We're not, in fact, rating loans from the ECB. We're not rating loans from the EFSF or ESM. We're rating the bonded debt payments. So if there are arrears on IMF payments or arrears on the ESM or arrears to the ECB, it might or might not affect our credit ratings. But to the extent that it affects the overall credit culture, then we would incorporate that. The third point I wanted to make is simply our approach. So we're trying to distinguish ourselves by taking the long view. And that's a much harder exercise than moving ratings or outlooks around if there is a decline in third quarter GDP. That's not what we're trying to do. So we're forced to pay more attention to the underlying structural impediments to growth and to the structural fiscal adjustment over the medium term. So the framework that the Commission provides in its Stability and Growth Program and medium-term objective makes sense to the extent that a country can do so without killing growth. I think to do this accurately, as Paul described, and he saved me a lot of time, is we try to take a holistic approach, which means looking into governance issues and the political environment, and which by necessity means not simply focusing on the quantitative aspects of analysis, but the qualitative aspects as well. As Vincent mentioned, what we do is partly, not wholly, but partly dictated by regulators. And ESMA and the ECB, followed by the SEC and OSC and other authorities, have required that we increase our transparency with regard to our quantitative analysis. We have done this by building a debt sustainability analysis framework along the lines of the IMF. But in addition, building a scorecard, which Paul described. And the problem we run into when trying to incorporate balance sheet approach or IPSAS, even if it did exist, is that it only exists in certain countries. And what we need to do, according to the regulators, is apply our analysis in a form that is continuous, consistent, rigorous, and subject to historical validation. So I think we're many years away from being able to analyze countries on an apples-to-apples basis as a result of differences in cash and accrual accounting. It's actually very, very frustrating because I found this forum so interesting for our own analysis. So what we do is we're about to roll out in each of our reports our scorecard inputs, the indicators, and then the scores that those indicators compute, and then the indicative sovereign ratings that are an output. And if there is a difference between those indicative ratings and the actual ratings that the lead analyst, lead sovereign analyst is recommending, then we provide, or we're going to provide to the public, a statement explaining why there is a difference. And it might be because the quantitative analysis has fallen short or because of qualitative reasons. So I think in the case of Greece, to try to answer Ian's question, there are really three forces in our view that are shaping Europe, and these materialize in our view on Greece. The first is that the political will to keep the Eurozone together remains very strong. And this goes well beyond the persona of Mario Draghi and his famous statement in July of 2012, that he would do whatever it takes, the ECB would do whatever it takes to keep the Eurozone together. And I think that this is readily apparent in the support mechanisms that exist, from the ECB programs to the ESM. For this reason, I think we're not concerned about the current program with Greece. I think it's without question going to continue, partly because of the refugee crisis and the idea of the Eurozone continuing without Greece in the presence of the refugee crisis would be viewed as a failure of governance. And I don't think that would be, that the Commission or the Council or other bodies in Europe would be willing to tolerate that. Second of all, we view that integration in Europe has stalled. This is not to say that banking union isn't being formed or that fiscal surveillance isn't improving. It's just that partly due to George's point, that due to the rise of populism, the fragmentation of political parties in Europe, this has prevented the institutional capacity from strengthening so that political decisions can be made quickly. This is readily apparent in the case of Greece, which is a shame, a real shame. So, for example, there's also not a clear plan of how to deal with a Brexit vote if it were to turn yes. This is severe, I think, connotations for Greece and the rest of the Eurozone. And then finally, one of the repercussions of this lack of integration, I think, is weak growth. And it's pretty safe to say that weak growth will continue in Greece for the foreseeable future. Now, this is partly because of high leverage. It's also partly because of the inflexibility in the labor markets. But nevertheless, this is one of the repercussions, I think, of a lack of institutional strength at the Eurozone level. So with that as context, that provides perhaps a bit of color of how we see the Greek case. So I'll stop there. I don't know if I have 30 seconds to take any questions, but sounds great. Thank you.